The primary purpose of Uniquely Human, the podcast, is to educate and inform. The views expressed during all episodes are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute educational or medical advice. Listeners should consult with professionals familiar with each individual or family for specific guidance.
Uniquely Human, the podcast, is produced by Elevated Studio. Music is graciously provided by Matt Savage of Savage Records.
Hi, I'm Dr. Barry Prezant, clinical scholar, researcher, and consultant on autism and neurodiversity, and a Brooklyn boy raised in the big city.
And I'm Dave. I'm none of those things, and I grew up on a farm in Illinois. But being on the spectrum myself, I have plenty of personal insight to lend.
And this is Uniquely Human, the podcast, a show that illuminates and celebrates autism and neurodiversity. Today, I am particularly pleased to have two guests on, and I'll explain why very briefly. It is so not only validating, but it just feels so good when you see folks taking some work that you had been involved in to some extent and really just flying with it, enhancing it, making it meaningful for clinicians and educators. So today, we have on Marge Blanc, and we have on Alexandria, but I'll call you Alex, Zachos. Welcome to Uniquely Human, the podcast.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to be here with you both.
Right. All righty. And we're going to really kind of dig in after I give you a little bit of information about Alex and about Marge. So Marge has been a pediatric speech-language pathologist for 50 years. Kind of joining my ranks there, working in public schools in the U.S. and Canada for 20 years. But when Marge was a clinical associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, she applied the principles of Gestalt language development that she says she's learned from some of our early work and Ann Peters and other colleagues, and she saw how effective they were. Her first article detailing the 3-year journey of her first Gestalt language processor was published as, quote, "Finding the Words to Tell the Whole Story." It was there that the term natural language acquisition was born, and you're going to be hearing a lot more about that term in the next hour or so. And that was chosen to reflect the naturalness of Gestalt language development. Her longitudinal research described Gestalt language development in a wide variety of children, primarily autistic children, and was published in her book, Natural Language Acquisition on the Autism Spectrum, The Journey from Echolalia to Self-Generated Language, which was published in 2012, but I understand is undergoing an updated version right now.
Finally.
Yes. Since that time, Marge has been actively involved in sharing natural language acquisition, consulting with health and education entities, and presenting courses and webinars throughout the world. She meets weekly with speech-language pathologists in various countries to translate international materials and to support colleagues' courses, articles, and research. Her current special interest, which I'm looking forward to hearing about, is documenting, quote, dual processors, close quote, and supporting various qualitative research endeavors. So look forward to the revised book that we had mentioned. Alexandria Zachos. Alexandria is a licensed speech-language pathologist, has been practicing for more than 20 years. Over the past 18 years, she has provided therapy for all ages in a variety of clinical settings, including public schools, home therapy, acute care, rehab hospitals, and outpatient clinics. She created the online community meaningfulspeech.com in 2020 to educate speech-language pathologists, professionals, and parents on Gestalt language processing, echolalia, and the step-by-step approach to helping support a child from delayed echolalia to original language using the natural language acquisition framework developed by Marge Blanc. Alex is an international speaker, often presents on Gestalt language processing, echolalia, both virtually and in person, and she has provided trainings and has spoken to clinics, school districts, and speech language pathology associations, and ASHA, of course. And she has an on-demand webinar available for continuing education units through ASHA. Alex is also a fluent Greek speaker and has provided several bilingual Greek-English evaluations for many school districts in the Chicago area, and also recently returned from Greece, right?
Yes.
That must have been a great opportunity. I was not aware that you were a Greek speaker. So let's begin a little bit with the history. So I realize that some of our listeners are probably beginning to hear or have heard about natural language acquisition and Gestalt language processing. But Marge, what motivated you to initially take a deep dive into these issues and expand a little bit on the notion of natural language acquisition?
So what motivated me was Barry Prezant. I will say that. And he told me, but not personally, at the end of his 1983 article that there needed to be longitudinal research. And I read that. And it was a decade later, but I read that. And I had already by then realized how well this approach worked to develop natural language, not just to train a child to say, I want chips or whatever, or to say a bazillion more words through some kind of language learning lab protocol, but to actually develop natural language. And so as I was at the University of Wisconsin, like we mentioned, I actually met my very first autistic kids. And I had been a very, long-term clinician by then, and I knew language sampling. This was the old days. And so child-led therapy was not unusual. It's not something that we had to learn from scratch like so many of the SLPs today have to do. It was just part of our training back in the 70s. It was part of what I did in all those years in public schools in the United States and Canada, and I did language sampling. I was very well versed in language sampling. So as I looked at my very first little autistic clients, I had language samples right away. And I could see that there was something going on that didn't seem all that strange to me. I mean, a child who says, let's get out of here, is not very unusual. And so when I talked to that very first client's mom, and I said, how did he come by that particular utterance? And she said, well, that's what his big brother says all the time. And so simultaneously, this was all serendipitous. I swear it was very serendipitous because there was a low-VOS replication study going on in Madison at that time. It had just started, and it was painful, I will say. I tried to help them, and they refused my help. Anyway, back to the original story. So between Dylan and his mom, Kathy, and I, we figured out where his gestalts were coming from, and we looked at Barry Prezant's work, and we put it all together, and things just went swimmingly. And just like the parents today tell us this, it's been that way since I knew about this protocol. And Barry Prezant told me, not face-to-face, but otherwise, that I needed to do some longitudinal research. So I just, picked up my pen and got started.
Alex, if you could, since we're tossing around the term gestalts,
Yeah.
if you could kind of explain a bit what that is, but I did want to interject one point here, since I was living in that era, and that is that we were steeped in trying to understand individual differences in language development, whereas the behavioral literature was pretty much saying, well, all kids learn language the same way through this process of contingent reinforcement and so forth. And so this gave us a lens to appreciate and respect that maybe there are different paths. So, Alex, let me go back to my original question. If you could talk a little bit about even the notion of gestalts and what that means maybe for our listeners who are first being exposed to this information.
Definitely. First, I just want to kind of make the connection to maybe why I'm on here and how I got connected with Marge and started my community. So I was a practicing speech language pathologist for 13 years before I came across Marge's book. I did not find it in 2012. I found it in 2016 through the recommendation of a colleague. At that point, I had been in private practice for a little while, and I felt like I kept getting calls and getting a lot of clients that were communicating with delayed echolalia, and I didn't know what to do about it, which is crazy since I had been working for 13 years at that point. But everyone I asked, I had a huge network of SLPs around me in the Chicagoland area. Every single person I asked said, ignore it, redirect it, tell them no movie talk. No one could point me to any good resources. And I started my career in the public schools, and the public school system that I was in had a lot of BCBAs that they employed. And basically, if a child came in with an autism diagnosis, they went straight into this certain programming, which was an ABA type of programming. And that was all I knew or had been taught to do. However, I felt that there was more going on there, that the children were trying to communicate something to me, that I shouldn't try to redirect it or extinguish it. And so I went hunting for resources, and luckily someone did recommend Marge's book to me. I read it cover to cover in 1 week, which is a really big deal because I had a baby that wasn't sleeping through the night at that point. And I immediately reached out to Marge. We got connected, and I consider Marge my mentor because I would not know this in depth had I not worked closely with her with two particular clients that we ended up presenting about at ASHA in 2018. And my mission kind of right now is to give everyone at least a basic knowledge of this. I always point to Marge when they start to want to get a lot more advanced knowledge and specialize in working with Gestalt language processors. But my real mission and why I went on social media and everything is I want people to at least understand the basics, to understand that we can't look at everyone through the same lens. Everyone is not an analytic language processor. So let's get back to the definition here of what a Gestalt is. So a Gestalt is an intonationally defined unit of language that is tied to a meaningful and emotional or dramatic experience for the child or person. And I think the big thing we need to think about here is in the early stages, a Gestalt language processor is picking up on the sound stream of language. They're picking up on the intonation, and they're not quite focused on words yet. That definitely comes a little bit later in their developmental process. So when well-meaning professionals and parents are working with children that they consider to be delayed, so maybe they're not talking a lot or they don't have a lot of words, they immediately start to look at them through this analytic or traditional speech development lens, and they go, okay, this kid needs more words. So they start working on, labeling or increasing their vocabulary and pushing these single words. And so stage one for a Gestalt language processor can look very different because a lot of them might just have a lot of single words. Some of them might have long strings of what are often labeled jargon, so unintelligible but intonationally defined speech. They all usually have rich intonation, and then some of them sound like what people consider to be movie scripting or YouTube scripting, so they are saying a lot of lines from media.
It's funny. We used to have a little phrase in the old days when you had a little cassette those little plastic things with the tape. And there was a brand called Memorex that manufactured these cassette tapes. And when you would hear a child sometimes who was using a lot of gestalts and obviously was a Gestalt language processor, we used to say, is it live or is it Memorex? You know, is it something that had been memorized previously? And of course, just to throw this in a little bit more in detail, the Lovassian view, that is Dr. Ivar Lovaas, who's the basically the grandfather of ABA, was saying it's not functional at all. And I observed that, and obviously not only did you guys observe it, but you went into much, much greater detail in understanding the process. So why don't we move to the notion a little bit, Marge, about moving from echolalia to self-generated language? So Alex just referred to the fact that, okay, there's a stage model, and you described some of the very, very early stages. But I know it's not easy to do, but if you can give us a brief overview of the stages so that we really nail home this point that we're talking about a developmental process here, okay? Right. And that you have to look through the lens of development.
I mean, back when Barry Prezant was, first becoming a household name, Ann Peters was around too. And she didn't get the distinction of being a household name so much because she was in linguistics. And by the way, she still is here. And she joined me in a webinar actually just a few years ago. So she, as a linguist, was looking at how kids actually develop language. And we had all kinds of theories out there. The one word seemed like a really logical beginning point. I mean, why not, right? You know, because it's like grammar, right? You start with a single word and you add some grammar. And in our, not so infinite, adult wisdom, we weren't looking at it from the child's perspective. And so what Ann Peters did is compile all this research that if you were there back in the day, you'd be absolutely spellbound by what people did with their little Memorex. And, people recorded their kids outside their bedroom door to hear what they did at night with this language that they were picking up during the day, like Alex said, either from an intonational contour or from single words, if they were an analytic processor or, somewhere in between. And that's our next frontier. But anyway, so the Gestalt, though, was a term that obviously, Ann Peters didn't coin the term Gestalt. We know it from German, we know it from psychology. But what she did was use the term language Gestalt to refer to an unanalyzed or pretty much unanalyzed chunk of language. And she didn't even necessarily talk about language at that beginning point. She talked about meaning. And so this goes back to, I'm getting too far from our topic here, but it goes back to what's going on in the mind of the child when they pick up this language Gestalt or this unit of meaning. And so that was what Ann Peters was not reminding us. We didn't get it at all. We were thinking about it from a completely adult perspective. And she said, but from a child's perspective, they don't know what a word is. They just know that you thought it was pretty cool because you pointed to it and gave it some sound. But it was also pretty cool to hear the conversation in the other room go like, are we going to go to McDonald's? Come on, kids, let's get ready. And so you, the Gestalt language processor, hears this chunk, come on, hooray. And you think, whoa, something really cool is happening here. And so you go and find your shoes and you're at the door and everybody thinks you're just kind of a linguistic genius because of that. And so as Alex is pointing out, though, some of those sound streams aren't as easy to identify with their intended meaning. Mm-hmm. So back in the old days, I don't know if you remember before the pandemic, but back in the old days, we didn't have quite so much media language that has made it harder and easier for Gestalt language processors to hear these chunks, these intonationally rich or melodic chunks. But anyway, back to the question, and that is, once you, as a child who picks up, come on, kids, we're ready. Once you've picked up that and you hear that word ready, you are thinking, whoa, this is a really cool word. Everybody gets excited. They go get their shoes. They get to the door. And then, come on, get ready. Get ready becomes really important. And you learn that it has actual meaning to that situation. And get ready is something you need to pay attention to. And so,
Marge, if I could just interject an historical point here. Ann Peters, of course, being a linguist, was not a person in autism, did not observe autistic kids. But you can go back to 1944. Lee O'Connor, who coined the term infantile autism, his second article was called Irrelevant and Metaphorical Language in Autism. And he was talking about Gestalt language processing. And he understood very often, as you both indicated, that there is meaning, but he said sometimes it's meaning based upon an association the child makes, and it may not be so transparent to us. So this is not absent from the autism literature from the earliest days of published work specifically on autism in children.
That's so important. It's so important to realize that, you know, as one of my old professors would say, there's nothing new under the sun. And, you know, yeah, we revisit this. And anyway, back to where I was, right? I'm going to try to just get back to stage 2 for a moment. So when the child realizes that get ready has meaning in this situation now, and when mom says, come on, get ready, it's really positive. And so get ready becomes something that the child recognizes can be, quote, to use Ann Peters and Barry Prezant's words, analyzed from that whole. And as Alex and I would say, you know, it becomes part of what one might mix and match with other times that you hear something of that nature. And so when mom says, oh, come on, kids, it's time to go to bed, and everybody groans, you realize that come on, kids is part of that same thing that was, come on, kids, let's get ready. You know, but as Alex pointed out with the intonation, vastly different. Mm-hmm. And so the meaning is quite different. And come on, kids, then can be a chunk that can, and I think Alex actually coined this terminology, can move from place to place. Mm-hmm. And Marge might say it's more applicable to more situations and allows a child to be understood in more situations. But nonetheless, it's stage 2.
And that's, and we could talk about conjoined chunks the same way we use the term conjoined, like a phrase, you know, to make more complex sentences. But now we got chunks that are put together.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's what Ann Peters told us. Ann Peters told us that at the 2-unit stage, you can either get word plus word, you can get a frame plus a word, you can get a mini frame plus a mini frame.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I was just going to jump in and say, I think sometimes all this terminology is just so confusing to professionals and parents. So just one of the things I try to do to simplify stage 2 is exactly what Marge says. I call it a mix and match stage or a trimming down, because some kids have those very long gestalts. One that I use very frequently came from one of my first clients I recognized as a Gestalt language processor. She would say, don't worry, I'll help you find your mama. And that was from Dora the Explorer. And she pretty much used it anytime she was looking for something. That's the meaning it held for her. And in stage 2, what I heard her start doing is she trimmed it down. So then we had don't worry. The rest of it was gone. And then I also heard her do some mix and match. So we had don't worry, I'll help you find grandma. And I remember the day her mom came in and told me she heard her say that the grandmother was visiting from another state and she truly was looking for her in the home. And I said, oh, we heard a stage 2. The language is, quote unquote, starting to move.
Yes. Yeah. And it's just so amazing when you see how kids are applying this. But I really appreciate your comment, Alex, about the jargon, because those of us in speech language pathology and linguistics love jargon. But I'm going to throw one more bit of jargon in here that you just described. And that's the notion of mitigated echolalia, that you don't repeat exactly what you had heard, but you make changes in it. And you just gave a nice description of mitigated echolalia. That simply means echolalia with change, and where you reduced the full utterance. Yes, absolutely. We'd like to take a moment to thank you for listening to Uniquely Human, the podcast. It is so gratifying to hear that so many of you find value in what we share.
It is gratifying, and it's so much fun making this show together, Barry. Being able to meet with you every week and all the guests and listener support that we've received, it's such a joy to make this show. And of course, we are commercial free, but Barry and I would invite you to support this show in a number of different ways. That could be buying our books, or even inviting us to speak live or virtually to your organization or to your community. To learn more about all of this, you can, of course, go to our websites, barrypresent.com or davidjfinch.com, to learn more about our speaking topics and how to work with us and all of the consultative services that we provide.
And we also want to know how we're doing. We are in a constant quality improvement mode here.
Yes.
So please make sure to leave comments and ratings, suggestions on social media. Contact us directly on the links on our website, and recommend Uniquely Human, the podcast, to those in your lives. In conclusion, we are so grateful to you, our Uniquely Human community, for your support and loyalty, and we'll be keeping at it.
Yes, thank you all so much. Now back to the show.
So let's move on to a little bit more complex grammar here, huh? We just got through stage 2.
And you know what? What I've learned since the book came out, and one of the reasons that this revision has to happen is because we have learned so much about the varieties of ways that kids go from stage 2 to 3 to 4. And maybe that's one thing that we can assure your listeners about Barry Present, is there's not a single way, there's not a single observation you can make and look for and put on your checklist. The only one that you can really put on your checklist is when a child is using, a random word. You're going to think it's a random word. Like in the article that I wrote in 2005, for my little guy, he went from, I got to get some toys, this very intonationally rich, stage 2, to I toy. Almost like, can you believe it? Something happened in my brain. Did you hear that? Is it okay? And our job, what I've learned more and more, truly more and more, is to simply acknowledge that it's good. And so we did back then. I knew from Barry Present's work that it was stage 3, but I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that I got to hear it right in front of me, right in front of the 2 grad students who were working with this child. And so stage 4 kind of morphs from stage 3 in infinite numbers of ways. And that's what I've learned since the days of our research. I mean, it was 15 years worth. You'd think that we had heard everything under the sun, but it's not really true. What we are starting to learn more and more is that whereas this cognitive capacity now to develop grammar is born at stage 3, it may take, nanoseconds, truly, like overnight. And the next day you hear, toy gone, toy mine, in this furtive way that says, I used to be able to talk in these big, long gestalts, and everybody thought I was kind of cool and melodic. And now I got to say, toy mine? So a lot of support. I think that that's what we're learning more and more and more now, is a lot of support at stage 4 is really important. And I think that's one reason that I think Alex and I and Dr. Prasad, I'm so glad you are joining us in this conference in the UK, whether it's about to happen or already has. Your words of kind of historical, premise and solid foundation is going to be so valuable to people because, as we know more and more kids and know more and more parents, we know that sometimes it's like that. Sometimes it's just like toy missing. And it sounds for all the world like, stuttering.
Right.
And, I think the other thing that we can assure you about is that stuttering could happen. We're not going to say stuttering couldn't happen anytime in a child's life, but more likely it's that first grammar and finding that first grammar that you know nothing about. This is your first opportunity. You're 4 years old or 6 or 8 or 10. And so we talk about language development, but where is it in your head and how do you find it?
If I could just jump in, first of all, I'm going to throw more jargon at you here. What you're talking about, which sometimes is mistaken as true kind of a stuttering disfluency, is formulation hesitation.
Yes.
That you're trying to think of the right word and you may repeat some words or it may sound like stuttering, but it's you're formulating, which gets my second quick point here, which underlies everything we're talking about. And that is learning language is a language, cognitive, social process. And that's what was missing and still is missing in some behavioral accounts. Well, speech and language, those are just behaviors, and a kid learns it by reinforcement, but it has nothing to do with thinking. It has nothing to do with organizing your concept of the world. And literally, so many behaviorists have said that Skinner said that. Over the years, when we're talking about to understand language development, you have to understand a child's cognitive style and cognitive development, as well as social emotional style and development. So obviously, so much of the public, and I mean both parents and professionals, have grasped onto this. It is one of the hot topics now in autism. So I'm just curious, we can begin with Alex on this one. Why do you think, and you see it and you live it, and Marge sees it and lives it, it has been so embraced and is taken off as very important information internationally?
I personally think it's because we finally gave a name and an explanation to something people had been seeing all along. And for those that maybe weren't seeing it or weren't tuned into it, it finally helped them see the path they had to support the child down. Because what happened for me and many SLPs that had been practicing for a while is I think we intuitively knew what we were doing wasn't working, but we had no other tools. Anytime, we would go and seek out continuing education, especially for supporting the autistic population, it was all, taught by people who wanted to share behaviorist-based techniques or strategies. And I personally felt lost until I found Marge's book, because I was going to work every day doing something that I knew wasn't fully supporting these kids, but I didn't know what else to do. And I just think the popularity that's the reason for it. People are finally like, thank you. Thank you for putting a name to this and for helping me really figure out how to support these kids. And they're seeing the results every single day. I mean, the messages that Marge and I and our team gets is crazy. I mean, people are just tweaking a little bit how they're responding to the child, or even just finally acknowledging their echolalia, and they're seeing huge differences.
In a few minutes before we depart, I definitely would like both of you to talk about the communities that have developed and how people can access those communities. But basically what you're saying is big question marks that were in the mind even of trained professionals all of a sudden began to have some answers, or at least frameworks, to understand why those questions were there and respond to what those questions were.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And at the risk of taking us down a rabbit hole, which I promise I will not do, I think another piece of this, well, there's several other pieces of this, I think. The neurodiversity movement is, I think, huge, because we are listening to autistic adults and other Gestalt language processing adults, and they're saying, that's how I did it.
Yes.
Yeah. Really? I mean, you guys, come on. How long have we been trying to tell you this?
Lived experience, yes.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. And then another piece of it, I think, is I'm going to call it the egalitarian. And that is, I think the three of us, have been always working side by side with parents, always.
Yes.
Side by side with our clients, our students, always. And I think that when you do that, the quality, so to speak, of your research is highly different from if you're looking at kids from an outside perspective. Or let's take any professional, be they an SLP or even a psychologist who might have a language learning lab that, I worked side by side with people like that who are wonderful people at the University of Wisconsin. And they would say, it's too hard to do Gestalt language processing research. Glad you're interested, Marge, because it's just too hard. Mm-hmm. And how are we going to measure it? And so how many people have decided to measure something that is measurable and picked single words because of that? Mm-hmm. So as we sometimes find we're going to call them the naysayers out there, who for very good and honest reasons feel like, natural language acquisition is, I think it's been called a red herring, as I recall, think that it just doesn't fit a theory very well. And those of us in this room here today might say, you know what? Our theory is pay attention to kids. Mm-hmm. What do kids do? What do kids really do? We go back to Ann Peters and we look at, and just, like Dr. Prezant said, we go back to, Leo Kanner. And, if you pay attention to kids, then you learn a lot. And parents do. And I think we've been speaking to parents all along, and clinicians, of course, but haven't been necessarily just speaking to our, in the old days, ivory tower researchers whose articles are really hard to come by, except I think now we've discovered open access, and sometimes we find out more about natural language acquisition from a naysayer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's, I have to say, I'm being quite honest here, it pains me when I hear very well-trained in many ways speech-language pathologists like Alex saying they weren't exposed to this information. But it goes to show, when you have a large country, and I could say it's been the US that's dominated speech-language pathology for years, decades, that you could have different pockets. So I know, my first autism course in 1979, I was teaching about Gestalt language processing, but our field is really based back into the 50s and 60s on behavioral models. And so there are still many people who consider themselves the language experts on the faculty, okay? But they really have had no exposure to all of the research on the relationships between language and cognitive development. for example. It still is a learned behavior that you train. And so it's certainly my students have been talking about this for a while, and we publish it in various versions. But I think in part due to both of your work, as well as social media, it's really, really gotten out there to people who say, like exactly what Alex just said. This helps to explain something that has been perplexing to us for so long. But more than that, and that's, I guess, my next question here for both of you, it impacts how we do assessments. It impacts how we work with parents. It impacts, of course, how we work with not only children, but some adults who still have Gestalt language patterns in their development. So if you would like to talk about that, maybe we could begin with Alex around assessment and implications for assessment. And again, we could do a full day deep dive into any one of these topics.
Maybe we'll have part two.
And then Marge, feel free to chime in also. But the assessment, kind of what we call the linkage between assessment and intervention. Some people don't like that term anymore, but certainly supporting children's development. Yeah.
Right. So when I was in graduate school, granted that was quite a while ago, and so I do like to talk to new grads. Saddens me not a lot has changed. So when I tell my story, even recent grads say that's my story too. But when I was in graduate school, I was basically taught just about standardized assessment. There was very little conversation about, oh yeah, go in, observe the child. It was like, get some family history, find out, what their diagnosis is, but then you go in there with 1 or 2 or 3 standardized tests. And when I graduated and was, in the working world, I realized, oh my gosh, this has to be done in 45 minutes or an hour. And I remember a particular case at the public school that I was working at during my clinical fellowship year. And for preschoolers, we would do a team-based assessment, which basically meant I looked at the communication, and then the social worker asked about development, and the nurse came in and asked about medical. And the nurse came in to me and she said, oh, this child is completely non-speaking and will not move from his chair. And I'm seriously worried about, his IQ, and we're going to get the psychologist in here and all of this. And so I went into the room to observe him. And to me, he kind of looked sleepy. And I thought, okay, let me try to engage him a little bit. Of course, I had my PLS and my box and my purple bear and all of that a lot of SLPs listening to this are very familiar with. And he didn't want anything to do with me, didn't talk to me. And the very sad thing is I had to write a report based off that very limited interaction. Let's flash forward 2 weeks to when the child actually comes into this preschool program that we have decided is best for him. He's skipping down the hall. He's smiling. He's talking a mile a minute. And I have written a report that has nothing to do with the child that I'm watching walk down the hall. And it was that day that I realized our system is so completely flawed. Okay, but I cannot make people change how their system is set up. So what I currently teach is if you have to give a standardized test for insurance for schools, do it. But just realize that the information that you're going to get from there is probably not going to help you in any way, shape, or form support your Gestalt language processor. So what I teach is what Marge wrote about in her book, which is considered an informal assessment, and it is based on language sampling. And I truly, truly feel that language sampling is in many ways all that we need. And if you are looking at a Gestalt language processor, you can use Marge's framework protocol to score the stages when you're looking at that language sample. Or and we can get into this some other time, but if they are minimally speaking or non-speaking, the information that I get from there also helps me look at, some different robust AAC systems, helps me think about what I want to bring in the next time I see the child. Ideally, we would like to assess over a long period of time, a month or 2 months, not writing some kind of report after 45 minutes. And ideally, I would love to see home videos and talk to families and see what language is like in different environments and not just in the clinic or in the school or the environment that I'm seeing the child in. I think a lot of SLPs have had a hard time wrapping their mind around this because, again, this is not what we are taught when we are leaving graduate school. We are almost taught the complete opposite. I have only been asked once in the past, I would say 7 years, to give a standardized test since I started really focusing on working with Gestalt language processors. And people are shocked by this as well, but my clinic took insurance for a very long time and I never gave a standardized test. And I would submit the information, the way that I teach it, use scoring using Marge's NLA protocol, and we had no issue with reimbursement. So I think we really have to deep dive into assessment as a field and look at other ways and start to move away from these standardized assessments with our Gestalt language processors, mainly because they are not giving us the information that we need.
Marge, any comments?
Well, in our clinic, we had all the insurance companies as well. And we did have MA back in the early days, and we didn't have any problems with that either.
MA meaning?
Medical assistance.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I know. We don't get to do that much anymore. Anyway, so we wrote massive long reports, and they would outline everything under the sun, including regulation. And we had OT come in and work with us. The thing I would say is that we actually called our first 3 months an assessment period. Now, granted, you could say, well, that was research, Marge, but it was also just good service delivery. And so we didn't really differentiate assessment and treatment, and it was all part of the same package. And like you say, Alex, if we continue to do language sampling, and you're right, it's not just the language that a child says. I mean, if they are a multimodal communicator, we're looking at the entirety of it. We're looking at the conditions under which, as Dr. Prasad said, that retrieval happens. Because we might say one day, language development per se seems to be X. And then under other conditions, we find that retrieving or finding that language, their formulating of that language is going to be vastly different. So we really wanted our assessment period to include all of that. But basically, yes. And the other thing that would happen is sometimes if we had to give a standardized test, we would say, Uncle Sam or somebody wants us to do this silly thing, so let's just do it and get it over with, so that the relationship with the child isn't broken. And that's the thing I worry about with standardized assessment and individuals who have to give tests is, if you're in a dyad that's very much about connection, blame it on, Governor, Walz or whomever it might be. But, it's not you deciding in our relationship, I want to make sure that you can check, so we have to bring in a third party, Mr. Potato Head told us to do it, whatever. And then you laugh about it.
Yeah. I think one of the difficulties also is an over-reliance on standardized tests really kind of elevates the notion of an expert model as the gold standard, where we know that the gold standard is valuing what parents have to say, is valuing what other people in the life of a child, siblings, have to say. And let me just say again, it's so interesting from my perspective because, Marge, I don't know if you remember this, but in 1982, I published a 2-part article in the ASHA kind of magazine journal, not Journal of Speech and Hearing Disorders. It was called the ASHA Journal. And it was called Speech Language Pathologists and Autistic Children, What is Our Role? And I had a whole section why standardized testing should be taken with a grain of salt if used at all for these kids back then. And of course, in our CERTS framework, we say you need to observe children across 3 different environments. We have detailed caregiver questionnaires. But what's the problem? It totally clashes with funding systems. So people say, I don't have the time to do that, or I can't gather all of that information. But we know it's the most efficient way to get truly authentic information that is representative of a child across different settings with different people. I mean, it's common sense.
I love that you have redefined gold standard. And so if we have a gold standard, yet we're only able to do the bronze version, at least we don't lose sight of what the gold is.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I just quickly wanted to jump in, Marge, you brought up regulation. So another thing that I think is important that we're not being taught as SLPs is looking at the whole child. And, regulation plays such a huge role with our autistic kids. And most SLPs they don't know what to do. They maybe haven't worked with OTs that understand this or worked with OTs at all. And if you are evaluating a child that is highly dysregulated that day, you are not going to get an authentic language sample. If you know that and you understand you're looking at the whole child and you still have to generate a report, you can document that. Back to my CF story, I was clueless. I had no idea. Now, if I knew what I knew then, I would have written something completely different. Obviously, that day, that child was dysregulated in the environment and completely shut down, closing his eyes, sitting in a chair. And everyone thought he was incapable of completing the assessment. We just didn't have the right tools and just were not educated in this other area. And I think as SLPs, we have to move toward looking at the whole child when we're assessing.
Absolutely. And if I can just give a plug here, a speech language pathologist named Terry Duncan up in Edmonton, Canada, has a book coming out in a few months. And the title of it is something like Emotional Regulation is Everything. And one of my longtime close colleagues, Amy Laurent, who is an OT and a PhD level developmental psychologist, through her Autism Level Up, which she partners with an autistic woman, actually Dr. Jacqueline Fady, and they're both at doctoral levels. I've been doing incredible work on regulation in Autism Level Up. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we have to get this into the training and into the vocabulary and culture of people in our field, but people in child development in general. It's just so important. So important. So much more we could talk about, but I'm just curious if you could briefly describe some of the communities that have developed around NLA and Gestalt language processing. Of course, we're going to put all the links you send us onto the webpage that will be connected to this episode. And also feel free to talk about the big conference out of the UK, the virtual conference that's happening in September. We'll have a link to that as well for the website. So,
boy, where to start? I think we are saying, first of all, that this protocol is just a description. We know that. We've never really defined NLA, and it's just a description of what Barry Prezant led us to, and we revalidated or validated, depending on the parts of it, in our research. So it's just a description of what kids do naturally when they use a gestalt or a chunk as their beginning point in language development. So the communities that have emerged, I think, partly what we're all saying. I mean, there's a long history. We have good research. We have a good protocol. We have a good way of explaining it. We have a good way that parents can recognize it in their children, just like Dylan's mother did long ago. We have all of that. And so what happens is, through social media, through Instagram, and who knows, I mean, I've never even looked at TikTok in my life, but somebody contacted me from Estonia because of a TikTok post that she read and asked me to do a training in Estonia, and it was virtual, thank goodness. But people are paying attention. And I think that, Alex, what you've done with Instagram is it's just stellar. Because what people are recognizing is, oh, okay, so this is something that's is accessible. I don't have to have a PhD, and I don't even have to understand those research articles, which I don't, and they're not accessible to me anyway. And, Marge has this book, and we have these courses, and there's so many free things now. And I'm leading up to one story which will illustrate it all.
If I could just interject very quickly. I think what you just said about, okay, wait a second, this isn't rocket science. Isn't that demonstrated on the Facebook NLA page, the Natural Language Acquisition or community, where you have so many parents chiming in and saying, I just read about this. Oh, look what I have found in my child. It's just amazing. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fine, because all of that was a prelude to my story anyway. No, but what happens, and this is what I found absolutely mind-blowing, it's just like Alex emerging from Chicagoland. People emerge from everywhere. And someone will write to me, from, I kid you not, Jerusalem, or from Brazil. Now, the Brazil connection was a very clear CERTS connection. I will just say that's how CERTS Brazil reached out. But in Italy, you would be amazed to find out, was amazed to find out, let's just say, which countries had no child-led speech and language services, period. Not even about Gestalt language processing, but nothing was child-led. And yet, 2 individuals in Italy, one in North Italy, one in South Italy, reached out and said, we really need to do something about this. So sometimes it only takes one person.
We call those people, and I think, I'm trying to remember where the term came from, mavens, people who are very excited by somebody else's work and helps to carry it forward and popularize it in a community maybe that would not have gotten that information before. So, Alex.
Yeah. I love that you just gave me that word, because that will help me talk about the next thing. So Kathy Schilling from the UK is a maven. She is doing the UK GLP conference, and she invited me out, not this summer, but last summer, June 2023. And I did 2 2-day seminars, one in the Cotswolds area and one in London. And that was amazing doing that live. But we all know when you do something virtual, a lot more people can attend. So this year it will be virtual in September. Dr. Present, Marge, and I will be some of the invited speakers. There's a whole lot of speakers. And so you can find all that information at The Speech Den.
We will include the link on the page. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. On social media, or the link. And then another maven goes by the name of Elizabeth. She invited me to Greece this summer, and that's how I was able to do the 2-day seminar there in Athens. And Dr. Present, although I do speak Greek, I did not feel comfortable presenting on this topic in Greek. My professional Greek is not very good. So we actually had this amazing translator that translated on the spot, and people wore the ear thing like they do at the UN. And it was just an amazing 2 days. So these people are out there, and they're inviting us to come talk. And I really think it's the power of social media that made all of this happen. So we hear all these negative things about social media, but in this way, it has been extremely, extremely positive. And in January of 2021, I started posting to Instagram, and I am a very old millennial. I'm barely a millennial. And so I had no idea how to even do anything on Instagram. And I got a very young SLP from my private practice that was working for me to teach me. She actually had an account for her dog that had like 10,000 followers at the time. And so she said, I know what I'm doing on Instagram, I'll help you. And that's how it all got started. And I think what really helped us move forward is being able to explain this in a way that people could understand. And we know how social media works, right? It's like you look at something for 2 seconds and you move on. So it has to be short and sweet and capture their attention. And we're still doing it. So you can find us at Meaningful Speech on Instagram or Facebook, YouTube. We have some wonderful interviews with adult GLPs that share their stories. Parents, they share their stories on there. We haven't done them in a little while, but there's a nice bank of videos on there. And then everything else is at meaningfulspeech.com. Both Marge and I have a free 1 hour I call mine a masterclass. I think Marge calls hers an intro. But if you want to know more after listening to this podcast, that's what you need to watch. They're both under an hour and can get you started in all of this.
Great.
And I'll add just to that there also is a 1 hour free course out there in Spanish, and that's with natural communication. And it's the same idea. Oh, I should mention one more. There's one more now that I'm going to say we did. And I partnered with someone in India to do for uncleft. And it's the same thing. It's just uncleft.com, UNCLEFT, but we'll put that in the show notes. But you can watch a 1 hour presentation that gives you a good foundation. And there's one being put together in French right now. There's one in Italian. There's one in Portuguese.
And that is exactly what unfortunately we have to conclude with due to our time limitations. But the point that was sitting on my tongue is that when some of the people who are beginning to look critically at some of this work and say, oh, well, implying that it's something being invented by these American speech language pathologists, it is being documented across many cultures and across many languages. So this is not just an issue that was fabricated by somebody who said, oh, it's a cool idea, let's put it out there and whatever with it. But thank you so much, Marge. Thank you, Alex, so much. This is just kind of, I know it's for some of our listeners, it's just a starting point. And hopefully we'll give you the resources. We know we will give you the resources. And as you follow up on those resources, it will send you down many rabbit holes that you want to go down and learn so much more. And I should conclude by saying that Dave Finch, my colleague, sends his regrets. He's actually on an airplane right now. But the truth of the matter is, having been married or being married to a former speech language pathologist, and I told him, well, there would be 3 of us on this podcast episode. He said, Barry, why don't you just kind of do it? But he sends his love to our listeners and to you guys as well. So thanks so much. And I look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.